Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at the dynamics of collective action. We ask what shapes protest against inadequate housing in South Africa, and what lessons can we learn? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. This week we're examining an article with a curious puzzle at its core. Many people in South Africa live in very unsatisfactory so-called backyard dwellings, but few take part in collective action to improve their lot. Why not? This puzzle centres on the broader idea, known to social scientists as the collective action problem, that people often struggle to work together to achieve a common goal, leading to suboptimal outcomes. This has long been explored by scholars and is ever present in our lives, in explanations, for example, of low voter turnout, depletion of natural resources, and foot dragging in action to tackle climate change. Yet collective action problems can be overcome under certain conditions. Think of successful strike actions or civil rights protests or the effective management of some local shared resources. And political scientists are naturally keen to understand what these conditions are, seeking answers by analysing group dynamics in different settings. Well, one such political scientist who's exploring these issues is Dr. Adam Harris, Associate Professor in Development Politics here in the UCL Department of Political Science, and also an associated researcher with the Centre for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. And I'm delighted that Adam joins me now to discuss some of his recently published research. Long-standing listeners may recognise him from his previous episodes looking at voting behaviour in Africa. So welcome back, Adam, to UCL Uncovering Politics. It's fantastic to have you on again. We'll get to the general questions about collective action later, but can we start with the case that you focus on in the article that we're concentrating on today, collective action among backyard dwellers in South Africa? Do you want to just explain, first of all, what are backyard dwellings and who lives in them?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Pleasure to be here. And yeah, so what's interesting, if we step back and think about South Africa, its apartheid past, when the ANC came into power, one of the promises that they made was everyone would get a house. They made this one of their key kind of post-apartheid development, addressing past inequalities where many of the black majority had been dispossessed of land, ownership of homes, land, etc. And as a result, they've had this long-running program. The name has changed over time, but popularly they're known as RDP houses. And these are houses that the government builds and then gives to the formerly disadvantaged groups under apartheid. And these houses are usually 4-bedroom homes, and they're on a plot of land. And when the person is given this land, they own the deed and they have full ownership over it. They have to live in it for 8 years before they can sell it. But the thing about this group of people that are being given these houses is they're now asset rich but cash poor. And so what do? They use their asset to earn money. So they build shacks in their backyard and rent these out. And these shacks or informal houses vary in quality. Some are very solid structures made of brick. Some are made of corrugated iron, some wood, etc. So there's a large range in kind of quality as well as size. Most of them tend to be kind of one room. The plots aren't overly large, but oftentimes there's 3 to 4. It's not uncommon to see 3 to 4 of these shacks in the backyard. This type of housing is the fastest growing in South Africa. There's no clear number on how many there are because it is, as we'll likely talk about, in this odd legal gray area. So like official numbers don't really exist. But what's interesting is the people that then rent these backyard dwellings come from a wide variety of backgrounds. We had, in our experience, both in the research and otherwise, you could have a single mother with 4 kids living in a 1-room backyard dwelling, or you could also have a single 20-something young professional or working class individual that's trying to find the cheapest, closest room possible to make and save money, and kind of everything in between. But oftentimes there's this interesting tension where you're paying rent as opposed to the person that owns the house who doesn't have any mortgage or otherwise payments. But you have to have some sort of income coming in. So either you're working and then you're paying the landlord a large chunk of your salary, as we all often do, or the other way that many people sustain themselves in South Africa is via government grants. But then this becomes quite tense because now I am using my government benefit in the form of a grant as a backyard dweller, but then I'm paying it to this landlord who already got a house from the government is now getting my grant money. So there can be a lot of tensions here. But this is, in kind of a broad sense, this is the situation we're looking at. And I'm happy to talk more, but it's, in a lot of ways, you can imagine that this is quite unique from someone living in kind of the exact same structure, but in an informal settlement or quote-unquote squatter camp, as the term in South Africa. But that's kind of the general group we're looking at.
Yeah, and you said we don't have exact numbers. Do we have any kind of rough sense of how many people are involved here?
I would hate to venture a guess. I mean, it's in the millions. I mean, you can go to kind of any of these, I guess they tend to be kind of lower income neighborhoods that are largely RDP houses. And every single house has at least one or two shacks in the backyard. I should be able to look at a better estimate, but off the top of my head, I don't have it.
And you don't talk terribly much in the article, actually, about the presence of the people in the kind of official housing in these neighborhoods and how people in the official housing and people in the unofficial housing are relating to each other. Is that an interesting part of the dynamics here that we should have on the table?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that relationship is less important for collective action as far as we saw here. But in a companion piece from the same larger project, we looked at barriers to upgrading these often low standard of living situations. And one key problem was that people struggled greatly with the landlord and trying to navigate that relationship, being monitored by them, being hounded for rent, etc. And so that dynamic does play a role in kind of the daily lives and the sense of dignity that these people have living in the backyard dwellings. But I think less so for collective action, at least.
So the kind of core premise, the starting point for your article, at least as I described it in the introduction there, is that people living in these backyard dwellings have reason to protest against their living conditions, but often don't do so. Is that a fair characterization of the situation?
No, 100%. A lot of these shacks, they're drafty, they're very cold during the winter, they're prone to fires because people are using candles to light because they don't have electricity. I mean, this varies. Some have electricity, some don't. They're often using coal-burning stoves, again, in a corrugated iron or wood shack. It is quite dangerous. Sanitation issues. Sometimes they have access. A lot of these RDP homes have a toilet inside, but also have a toilet outside. But oftentimes, again, the landlord crops up again, will lock it so they can't access it when they need. So there's a lot of different challenges. Accessing clean water, etc., can be a challenge. So and again, just living in an informal structure has its own individual challenges of health, safety, security, especially in some of these neighborhoods being not the safest, and being both protected from other people as well as the elements. So there's lots of reasons to believe that this is not the ideal living situation. And so you would think that given the drastic needs of all these people that you would see more demands coming from this community. Unlike informal settlement, people in informal settlements tend to protest at much higher rates in South Africa than those in backyard dwellings. And so we're wondering, what are these unique challenges here?
Let's talk about the research then and the methodology of the research. So I think last time you were on the podcast, you were talking about quite quantitative work that you had been doing, whereas here it's really deep qualitative work. Do you want to tell us what you've done?
This was really fun. So my co-author, Andrea Sheba, who's at the Humans Sciences Research Council in Cape Town in South Africa has been working in the backyard space as an urban geographer and sociologist for a number of years, and has long-running relationships with these communities. And so we piggybacked off of these long-running relationships and kind of selected 3 different neighborhoods in Cape Town that vary in the types of structures, the density of structures, whether they're on public or private land, looking at socioeconomic diversity, where one is kind of a bustling hub of urban work versus others that are kind of sleepy suburbs where there's less opportunity. And so we tried to get this variation to try and understand, to leverage across various different types of communities that have at least some minimal set of backyard dwellers. What are the circumstances and that might promote or hinder? So we conducted a number of focus groups in each community. We did interviews with local leaders, and then we also did site visits to, from the focus group, we asked 2 or 3 people from each focus group if we could go with them, and and they could explain the living conditions, and we could talk about the challenges they face in kind of more detail. So that was our kind of general approach.
And many of our listeners are young researchers, people interested in doing research in the future. And what was the argument for taking a qualitative approach here rather than doing a more quantitative, survey of lots of people and analysing the numbers on what people are saying?
Yeah, so I think because, we have, as you mentioned in the intro, we have kind of intuitions about what hinders or promotes collective action, but we know so little about this unique type of housing. And it's, you find it in Brazil, you find it in San Francisco, you find it in a little bit in Kenya, but varying in formality and informality. But the thing is, it is so unique that we don't really have any idea of what's actually going on. We could easily kind of apply our theory and then ask questions in a survey to test if our theory is right. But I think we'd miss the unique dynamics of what's going on in the daily lives and on the ground. And so the goal here was less to kind of test a theory, but take our intuitions, be open to kind of explore, but actually develop a theory that takes into account the unique context here. So this is actually a theory building rather than a theory testing process, which I think qualitative research always lends itself more nicely to.
I was really interested as well that you had 3 elements to the qualitative research. You had the focus groups and interviews, and then you actually visited people's housing, people's own dwellings, the people whom you had in the focus groups and the interviews, in order to really see what their lives were like. Was that always the design from the start? Did you always intend to have those 3 elements, or did it kind of evolve over time? Often qualitative research does have this more kind of evolutionary process to it, whereas with a quantitative design, you've got your survey, so you need to work out exactly what questions you're asking from the start. How did this one pan out?
Yeah, so I think we had those 3 elements set out, but I think what they became, especially the site visit, because we had Lewis Rice, who's at University of West England, the other co-author. He is an architect. And so he wanted to do these site visits. And it started out as a very kind of measurement, pictures, with permission, etc. But then the urban geographer and the political scientists couldn't help ourselves but also ask other questions, right? And so we got a more qualitative picture of daily struggle, daily frustrations, both with government, landlord, just general economic conditions. And so I think the site visits became a qualitative interview about the physical space, which was quite new and interesting to me. And I think even in this article, I don't think we fully exploited all that we learned, which would be interesting to kind of explore some other angles there.
It's often the frustration. You do this incredibly rich research. I find this with qualitative research in particular quite a lot. You kind of learn so much interesting, curious detail, and then you've got to somehow get it into an 8,000 word article. You just never get it all in there. Yeah. So let's go on to the results then. So the core question here is, what are the key determinants of variation in level of collective action? And I guess maybe we should say there's quite a lot of variation between the 3 neighbourhoods that you looked at in terms of of the amount of collective action. Perhaps you should say a little bit about that first, and then we can go on to the causes of that variation.
Yeah. So we had one community, the kind of bustling economic hub, where there was basically nothing going on, and that was where shacks were dense. There were the proportion of people that were in the area that were living in shacks versus not was much higher. People in shacks were much higher than those not, whereas the case was not true in the other two instances. And then we saw another one that had they were working together to improve their livelihoods, but wanted nothing to do with government. They were actually worried that the government would come and disrupt their current status quo because these shacks aren't entirely legal, but they violate a lot of building codes, which makes them illegal, and some have been raised. But it's not politically, it's not in anyone's political interest to go through and destroy the homes of the poor. But they don't want this unwanted attention. And then in the third one, they actively sought the attention of government and made demands and were saying, we're here, you can't forget us, we're not going away, you will listen to us, and you will respond to our needs. And we saw a number of reasons for this variation. I think one thing that we used as kind of a theoretical tool was this idea of infrastructural citizenship, which is this endogenous process in which people that can't access the benefits of the city, public transit, high quality sanitation, clean water, parks, green areas, etc., don't feel a part of the city. Their membership and full citizenship is minimized because they can't access this. But the only way to deal with that is by accessing it. But you can't because you're at this disadvantage because you're not a full citizen, right? And so we found that what was interesting is the degree to which your shack or your dwelling was legal had a key implication here. And what we mean by that is that and not in any sort of like legal law sense, but in like a perceived sense, when your dwelling was on public land. So oftentimes in Cape Town, there's these flats that are built, there's some backyard space, and they build shacks there. And the flats are owned by the council, kind of council housing, as it were, if we translate it to UK parlance. And those people made a claim, we're living on government land, we deserve access to the services. And the government could actually respond if they wanted to, and they did, saying this is our land and we can actually do something. Because it became more difficult when the dwelling was on private land, because then the government wasn't sure, can we intervene? And if we do intervene, who's responsible for maintaining repairs, for example, on the building? Is it the landlords now? And then there's the difficulty of, does the landlord then get another subsidy from the government where we're now building shacks for you to then make money off of it? So it becomes very complex where what the government can do and would do and is willing to do. And so people oftentimes, if you're on private land and you did make a stink to the government about failure, they'd be like, well, we can't do anything, which only further emphasizes this feeling of otherness and that you're not fully a full citizen of the city because the city's not willing to work for you.
That's really interesting, actually, because when I first read the article and the idea that if you're in less legal housing, we're in this grey zone, then that makes it harder to engage in collective action. And I guess I kind of thought with that, isn't that a fairly sort of obvious thought? We sometimes think, for example, about illegal migrants and the difficulties that illegal migrants have in engaging in collective action. But I guess there the mechanism is much more that if they put their heads above the parapet, the danger is that they'll
deportation. Right?
Yeah, they will be removed. Whereas the mechanism that you're talking about is actually. It's not one about if they put their heads above the parapets, then they're going to have their houses raised because the political costs to that are just too high. So that's not actually the worry here. Rather, it's more about this notion of the nature of their citizenship and the lack of meaningful embodiment of that citizenship in action by the government in their lives that is the problem.
Yeah, and it's hard to kind of put your finger on, and no one in our focus groups kind of use this language, right? Because it's a very kind of academic way of thinking about it. But it was this kind of exclusion and feeling outside of the benefits or regulations or care of the city, and this frustration that, we do deserve this, right? Even if we did migrate from rural areas, or which many have, we still are citizens. We have the legal right to be here. Again, the legality of our current exact physical location is unclear. And so it does create this space where I guess maybe you have a little bit more maneuverability, but there seems to be a cap on that and a ceiling on that, where at some point you can't even if you did get people to the streets and make demands, the expectation is that the government can't do anything, or at least uses that as an excuse to not do anything. And so there's this kind of rhetoric around it that keeps people in this, kind of trap of exclusion. But what did happen is the community that was able to rally and make these claims, because most of their shacks are on public land, they did get the government to put in water meters, extra toilets, because also one of the regulations, especially in Cape Town, is that each household is given a certain amount of water each day. And if you have backyard dwellers, that is shared across 4 households, unless the government can come in and give everyone their own fob that they put on the thing, take out their water, and then that will monitor their household. So now you have 4 households each having their allotment rather than sharing one household's allotment, which is a major improvement, right? Which we saw once they were able to rally. But again, it was in a space where it was easier for the government to intervene. Then the other side of the thing is with these RDP houses, almost every single person that we talk to is on the waiting list. And some people have been on the waiting list since 1994. And the rate of production of houses is well below where it should be. And there's talk that the program's going to stop, which again is very politically costly, but also it's not, the government can't afford it for lots of different reasons. But so people are eager to get off this list and get their own house. They don't actually, what they really want is to protest for homes, right? But this isn't, you have to just kind of wait to get off the list, and there's a lot of accused and evidence of corruption in the list and how people jump up and etc. But the fact that there's this promise of a house makes people focus more on getting the house and getting out, rather than trying to build the community and build this resilience and build this movement, right? And there's, at least, not that we found any evidence beyond what a couple respondents said, but they also said that they seem to think that the government will take leaders of these groups and give them a house. And oftentimes these homes are built far away, and then they're physically removed, but then also now their interests have been met and they're sorted, right? And then this kind of puts a lot of hindrance. So the people involved and the group is always shifting and changing, because there is this kind of other, what we call an escape hatch, that I can kind of escape this space rather than try and make this space better. And so there's this kind of difficulty also.
Yeah, so I started this bit of the discussion saying you've got 4 factors that you introduce, and for the benefit of those listeners who may be waiting for and second, I think we've kind of gone through 3 of them so far, haven't we? So we've talked about the degree to which the people in these communities are occupying a legal grey area, and the way in which that kind of shapes their sense of citizenship and what they can demand from the state. Kind of quite closely allied to that is the notion that they're also looking for a house elsewhere. So they're looking for a proper house, if you like, one of these RDP dwellings. And that is, I mean, I think you're arguing in part that just means that people are focusing their attention elsewhere. Yeah. But I think you also argue that particularly in the community that saw the least collective action, there's a sense that people are worried that if they do get something from the state in their current housing, then the state will regard that as having done its duty, and they'll be removed from the list for proper housing. And then the third factor that we've talked about there is there's a lot of diversity among the dwellers in these communities. And indeed, I think you're kind of suggesting that there's perhaps the state is deliberately introducing an element of diversity and to kind of divide and rule and picking off people who might start to take action and giving them housing in order to take them out.
Because they don't want any more negative attention associated with this housing project that was the flagship of the ANC government that is clearly fallen short. I wouldn't say failed, but it's clearly fallen short.
And is that part of a kind of wider phenomenon here of diversity among the people within a community, making it harder for the people in that community to engage in collective action?
Yeah, because if everybody's kind of at the same socioeconomic level, has the same demands on their time, it might be just logistically easier to coordinate. But what we found, especially in the area where we were kind of, one would expect the most action, this is where the diversity was highest, mostly socioeconomic. You had lots of young working professionals, single men, and then you had lots of elderly folks, and then you had lots of kind of young families and lots of and then a substantial number of single mothers. These people all have different, and especially the last two groups, lots of demands on their time. They're trying to survive and make ends meet, but they also have different shifts and interests and different stages of life that makes it hard for them to kind of coordinate. At least was our kind of deduction. So to get the single mom to come to a meeting after the kids are in bed or when she's trying to get food on the table when people have knocked off of work and are ready and maybe have some time, right? And so it is this kind of socioeconomic diversity that we're thinking of.
Yeah. And I guess it is partly diversity there, but partly also just people living in poverty with very complex lives, have so many demands on their time, so many stresses that, trying to engage in collective action to pursue some kind of further goal, it's just very difficult to make space for it.
Yeah. Completely.
And then the final factor that we haven't mentioned yet, correct me if I'm getting all of this wrong, but the leadership and the presence of charismatic leaders. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so we found that there was kind of lack of leadership in the first community, moderate but kind of divided leadership in terms of kind of favoritism by the local leader. And then in the one that we saw successful collective action, we had a kind of open, charismatic leader that was very much so invested in improving people's lives, and because again he kept saying because he was one of them. But why this community had him is another question. But because they did, he was able to kind of stay on top of things. And oftentimes the way that people responded when we were asking them about everything that's going on is that they're like, our local counselor is doing nothing. He's actually doing the job of the local counselor, not being paid for it, and he's bringing us services that the local counselor doesn't care to give or doesn't have time or whatever else. And so what's interesting is this is a way to help people. I guess in the literature, it's a leader can play kind of a coordinating mechanism of this is what we're going to work for, this is what we can do, we'll do this, right? And then get everybody on board. And I think it's important, especially in urban spaces, because a lot of the collective action literature, a good segment of it looks at kind of rural spaces where you have these kind of different social institutions or clubs or just kind of social ties that exist in a less anonymous setting that keeps people, quote unquote, in line and pulling their weight to make sure that the good of the community is worked for. Where you don't, and then I have some work with Lauren Honig in Zambia and Malawi on that, but in the urban space, it is anonymous. You can kind of easily fall through the cracks. But if you have someone that's trying to keep everybody involved and keeping that social capital and the power in numbers alive, then you might see some positive progress.
We have then quite a kind of complex set of quite interlinked factors that are shaping outcomes here. What are that's of course important for understanding these communities in themselves, and that's a really valuable exercise in itself. What are the general lessons we can draw out of this research?
Yeah, so I think that in some ways, as I think you mentioned, with you commented earlier, it's not kind of an obvious answer. In some ways, we're reaffirming a lot of what we understand about collective action and the free rider problem and just the difficulties of getting people out there. But I think what we find with this community that's living in this unique kind of legal gray area is that once people feel more integrated into the city, they're more likely to then make more claims on the government and hopefully then improve their lives for more fully and as the government continues to respond to them, at least in some kind of informal way, it does bring more legitimacy and potentially more sense of legality and permanency and membership in the state. And so it can get us out of a vicious cycle to a positive cycle, but it's first overcoming some of these other barriers that we talked about, of kind of moving us into the place where we can make some sort of demand and see the benefits of that, and then maybe that can rally people around. And I think you mentioned, kind of the challenges of undocumented immigrants and trying to make demands and trying to find a place for themselves, even though rearing their heads might be difficult. I think some of these implications have been borne out in a lot of the research on LGBTQ protests, in that, again, there's some evidence to suggest that as more legal progress is made, this gives it more space to reach actual equality, right? Once, for example, gay marriage is legalized, etc., and then we can see progress forward. So as long as we can kind of make progress and legitimize people's livelihoods, lives, and presence, at least in this instance in the city, this could potentially empower them to demand more, and maybe we can see improvements in their livelihoods. But then the problem is, if the government is aware of this, and as we've seen, there might be some reasons to prevent this, because the government doesn't want negative attention, is already stretched and has so much to do. And so there's some pushback there to be able to make those small incremental legalizing steps.
And what are the next steps for you in this project? I mean, are you working further in these communities? Are you engaging with them, and how to improve their lot?
Yeah, I mean, as is the perennial academic problem, is being pulled in different directions, but also trying to find some money to fund a larger project. So we've got these kind of small scale, community level, kind of Cape Town specific research we've done. We'd like to look at these dynamics more broadly, because there's also a lot of protest action happening in Johannesburg, lots of different dynamics, and the municipality is responding differently. If we could get kind of a multi-city, eThekwini, Nelson Mandela Bay, etc., if we can kind of get some of these other spaces to kind of look at differences in how the municipality, because we have one municipality that's fairly united in its response in Cape Town, but trying to think about how these things play out under different circumstances would be fascinating. And so with my co-authors, we're actively looking for other funds to do something a bit more broad, that I think would end up being mixed methods anyway, get some more systematic evidence to test this theory, but also get that new qualitative work to try and understand, again, these daily dynamics, and because understanding how to improve people's livelihoods was the drive behind this project in its origin.
And just finally, I was intrigued, you mentioned that one of your co-authors is an architect.
Yeah.
And the other one, I forget now what you said his background is.
So it's urban geography, but also urban sociology. So.
And how does that kind of interaction of very different research traditions in working on something like this operate?
Yeah. No, it was fun. It was really interesting. And it took us a while to kind of figure out what each one wanted to do. I think especially Andreas, the urban geography sociologist, was able to speak to both of us fairly well. But I'm so steeped in political science and quantitative political science, and he's in architecture. And I just had no idea about what architectural research looks like and things like this. And so it was a learning experience, and I learned a lot about different methods. But then the most difficult part was, as we talked about, we had this large set of data, and then how do we write a paper together that speaks to all of our contributions? And a lot of journals and even grants like interdisciplinary work, but it's hard to find a home because publication outlets tend to be very disciplinary. So we have kind of a more architecture one, which we didn't talk about today, and then this kind of more political sciencey one. And they each found homes in kind of African studies journals, which we're happy with. But I think in the future it'd be really nice to fully integrate it and really get that interdisciplinarity central to it, but it does take a lot of work.
Yeah, we're often encouraged to do interdisciplinary work, and so it's can be quite hard work, but it's fun and can bring really interesting results.
Yeah, definitely, for sure.
Well, Adam, thank you so much. This has been such an interesting conversation, and we'll definitely have you back on when you've done the next stage in this project. It'd be great to hear where you go next. We have been looking at the article Making Demands on Government, Theorising Determinants of Backyard Residents' Collective Action in Cape Town, South Africa, written by Adam Harris, along with Andreas Sheba and Lewis Rice. It was published earlier this year in African Studies Review, and as ever, you'll find the full details in the show notes for this episode. Next week, we'll be discussing fiscal transparency and government finances. Remember to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was researched by Alice Hart and produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.